Perhaps no single name is associated with greatness in the field of art more than the name of Michelangelo. Certainly, there has never been a greater sculptor. More than 500 years after his death, people still flock to Italy to see his colossal statue of David and his poignant marble rendering of the Pieta. Yet sculpture was only one field in which Michelangelo excelled. He was also a masterful painter, and his work on the Sistine Chapel is probably the most stunning fresco ever created. In addition, Michelangelo was an architect and a superb and prolific poet. In all his versatility, he, like Da Vinci, was the consummate Renaissance man. In the session on Leonardo da Vinci, we described the Renaissance in detail, and you may want to review the beginning of that session to prepare yourself for an understanding of Michelangelo and his work. In summary, the Renaissance was a golden age of human learning and creativity. It was a time of exploration, discovery, new knowledge and thought, and unprecedented artistic achievement. The Renaissance occurred chiefly throughout the 15th and 16th centuries in Italy. In the 15th century, when Michelangelo was born, the leading city of the Renaissance was Florence. But by the end of that century, the center had shifted to Rome. One reason for this shift is that Rome was the home of the Pope, and the Pope was an enthusiastic and generous patron of the arts. Rome remained the artistic and philosophical center of Italy throughout the 1500s, when Michelangelo was doing the majority of his work. As an artist, Michelangelo's style reflected the essence of the Renaissance, the return to the classical form that had characterized ancient Greece and Rome. This classical style included the idolatry and idealization of the human form, which was always depicted as beautiful, strong, even magnificent. But like all great artists, Michelangelo also explored new forms and styles. He is credited with introducing and influencing a new style of art called mannerism. A mannerist paints from his own imagination rather than from nature. As you may remember from the session on Da Vinci, mannerism is quite a departure from the Renaissance norm. During the Renaissance, artists painstakingly studied and sketched nature in the hopes of duplicating it more accurately in their paintings. Michelangelo began to slowly shift art towards a greater reliance on imagination. Imagination was a quality Michelangelo possessed in generous amounts. He created monumental works in painting, sculpture, and architecture that brought him fame in his own time and for centuries thereafter. In the days of the Renaissance, he was called the Divine Master and was considered almost a semigod. Most remarkable about him was his skill at carving marble. He always saw himself as primarily a sculptor. Though he worked in other arts at only certain periods in his life, he worked in sculpture consistently. And as a sculptor, he is unsurpassed. His greatest gift to art was his almost supernatural ability to bring hard, cold marble to a vivid life. He was a man who could animate stone. His treatment of the human body, both in marble and in painting, evokes strong emotions in all who see his work. He gave his figures a sense of grandeur, both in size and in mood, that is both human and more than human. Michelangelo was born on March 6, 1475, in a village 40 miles outside of Florence, then the center of the Renaissance. His full name was Michelangelo di Lodovico Buonarroti Simoni, but he was known simply as Michelangelo Buonarroti. Michelangelo was one of 5 sons, born to a woman who was so sickly that she had to hire a wet nurse to care for her new baby. The father and husband of this wet nurse were both stone cutters, and Michelangelo would later say, "I took in with my nurse's milk the chisels and hammers I use in my sculpture." When he was still an infant, Michelangelo's family moved to Florence. His father hoped the boy would have a career in government or in literature. Up until the Renaissance, literature was considered a higher art form than painting. But when Michelangelo was 13, his love for art and his precocious skill was already undeniable. He became an apprentice to the painters Domenico and David del Ghirlandaio. Michelangelo was no ordinary apprentice. So talented was he that while other apprentices paid tuition, he was given a salary. His master once remarked, "That one, in truth, knows more about drawing than I do." Michelangelo's apprenticeship was supposed to last 3 years, but he left after only one, saying he had no more to learn. In 1489, when he was only 14 years old, Michelangelo joined the circle of one of the most influential and powerful men of the Renaissance, Lorenzo de' Medici, known as the Magnificent. Medici was a nobleman with a passionate interest in art. He invited Michelangelo to study his superb collection of ancient sculptures and to study with Bertoldi di Giovanni, the master sculptor who supervised his collection. Soon after Michelangelo attempted his own first sculpture, the head of a faun, a woodland deity from Roman mythology. Lorenzo was so impressed he invited the boy to live with him at his palace, where he treated him as if he were his own son. Michelangelo had a generous allowance, beautiful apartments, and most importantly, access to Medici's art collection and his collection of prominent Florentines. Michelangelo spent hours in conversation with the leading poets, philosophers, writers, and politicians of the city. Meanwhile, he worked on his drawing and practiced carving on stone. His talents, so remarkable for a teenager, caused jealousy among some of the other young sculptors. One of them initiated a fight and punched Michelangelo in the face, breaking his nose. The bones never healed properly, and Michelangelo was left with an oddly flattened nose that's apparent in drawings made of him and in his own self-portraits. He had since childhood believed himself ugly, and now he became permanently convinced of it. This sense of his own lack of attractiveness often created shyness and contributed to a lifelong frustration over what he perceived to be his lack of perfection. His appearance, in truth, was only unusual. Michelangelo had a large head, thin lips, and black curly hair. His shoulders were broad, and his wrists and forearms became thick and muscly from his sculpting work. He was ambidextrous, and worked as well with his left hand as with his right. 3 years after Michelangelo joined the Medici house, Lorenzo died, and Michelangelo returned home. He was devoted to his family, even though his father was often cruel to him. For his entire life, he helped support the family, often making sacrifices so his brothers and father could fulfill their own desires. During his 2 years at home, Michelangelo worked with stone and marble, and like Da Vinci, dissected human corpses so he could further his understanding of anatomy. When he was 19, Michelangelo received an invitation from Lorenzo Medici's son, Piero. There had been a heavy snowfall. Would Michelangelo please come over and construct a giant snowman in the palace courtyard? Michelangelo obliged, and although there is no exact record of what the snowman looked like, it's easy to assume it was not a typical 3 snowballs in a stack variety. After the snow episode, Michelangelo stayed on at the palace until the arrival of an unexpected visitor, the French army. When enemy troops from France advanced toward Florence, Michelangelo fled, heading first for Venice, then Bologna. Bologna was a critical chapter in Michelangelo's life, for it was here that he first saw the fanatic monk Savonarola. Michelangelo was heavily influenced by the sermons of the fierce, black-hooded monk. Savonarola had a large hook nose, sallow skin, and fiery dark eyes. He used to preach to the people of Florence that their city would be destroyed unless they gave up their worship of the pagan Greek and Roman gods and went back to the teachings of Jesus. Michelangelo was greatly moved by Savonarola, and although he'd been inspired by the beauty of pagan art, he had a deep faith in God that, combined with the influence of the passionate monk, led him to pursue more Christian subjects in his artwork. In addition, Savonarola's apocalyptic vision would later synthesize with Michelangelo's own tragic sense of human destiny, reflected most vividly in his painting of the Last Judgment. In Bologna, Michelangelo carved small marble figures for a church while he waited patiently for the French to leave. When they did, in 1495, he returned to Florence, but shortly after, he left again, this time for Rome. Rome, already a city endowed with fine ancient art and sculpture, was on the rise as the new cultural center of the Renaissance. There were many opportunities for learning, and there were opportunities for work. One of Michelangelo's first commissions in Rome would lead to one of his first and greatest masterpieces. The commission came from a French cardinal who wanted a large marble statue of the Virgin Mary holding the dead Jesus, a configuration known as a Pietà. Pietà, although not commonly known, is not the specific name of Michelangelo's famous sculpture. It is a general name applied to a type of devotional image. This particular Pietà, however, was unlike any that had been done before, far more realistic and emotional. It brought instant fame to the young sculptor. The following year, Michelangelo returned to Florence and was immediately commissioned to create yet another masterpiece. This time, he was asked to carve a statue of the biblical hero David, slayer of Goliath the giant. His 2 most famous sculptures had now been completed, and Michelangelo still was not even 30 years old. But there were more masterpieces to come. In 1505, Michelangelo began work on a fresco of a battle scene for a wall in the new council chambers at the City Hall. He was working side by side with the grand old master of the Renaissance, Leonardo da Vinci. On one wall, da Vinci was painting a scene of the Battle of Anghiari. On another, Michelangelo was painting the Battle of Cascina. Michelangelo was 23 years younger than da Vinci, and although he respected da Vinci, there was also intense rivalry between the two. They often worked in quiet, each trying to ignore the other. They sensed, as did the citizens of Florence, that the work was taking the shape of a competition. However, it was a competition that was never resolved. Da Vinci abandoned the project in its early stages when he was offered important commissions elsewhere. Michelangelo was also soon called away. Both artists left behind elaborate drawings that indicate the murals, if completed, would have been stunning in their mastery of movement and action. When the murals were abandoned, Michelangelo was called to Rome by Pope Julius II, who wanted him to design and build a tomb. It was not an ordinary tomb. The Pope wanted it to have 3 stories, 40 statues, many of them larger than life-size, and he expected the project to be finished in 5 years. It took 34 wagons to carry the marble to Rome that would be needed for the tomb. Later, Michelangelo would order 60 more wagons full. To expedite the process, Michelangelo paid for the marble himself, expecting to be reimbursed by the Pope. But when he went to collect his money, the Pope refused to see him. Furious, Michelangelo stormed back to Florence. But he was not free of the tomb, and he would not be free of it for 40 years. The tomb of Pope Julius became the most lengthy and troublesome project of Michelangelo's life. He worked on it on and off, year after year, and once said, "I have wasted all my youth chained to this tomb." After he'd stormed off to Florence, Pope Julius summoned Michelangelo to Bologna, where the Pope had gone on a military mission. This time, he asked Michelangelo to make a huge bronze statue of himself, the Pope, to be set over the door of the cathedral in Bologna. This project, too, was a trial for Michelangelo. His expenses were greater than his salary. He had to work under difficult conditions. The assistants he hired were troublesome, and he had to share a room and even a bed with them. The weather was oppressively hot, and an epidemic of the plague broke out. When the statue was completed, Michelangelo was delighted to return to Florence. This delight lasted only a few months. Once again, the Pope called for him. He had yet another project, a project that didn't interest Michelangelo in the least. The Pope wanted him to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican, a chapel used for many of the most important events of the Vatican, including the electing and inaugurating of new popes. Michelangelo refused. He wanted to continue working on the tomb, and besides, he said, "I am a sculptor, not a painter." The Pope thought differently, and the entire world came to agree with him. The Sistine Chapel was a task that would require not only great creativity and skill, but enormous physical labor. Originally, Michelangelo arranged to have help from other artists, but he soon grew dissatisfied with their work and proceeded alone. He worked from a scaffold on his back, with paint dripping into his face and eyes, had muscle cramps in his extended arm and his back. He worked quickly, anxious to get back to work on the tomb for his patron Medici. He seldom stopped to eat, munching instead on a piece of stale bread he took up to the scaffold with him. At night, he worked by candlelight, and he had a mattress brought up so he could often sleep on the scaffold. When he did leave the scaffold, it would be late at night, and even then he wore his working clothes to bed. He kept his work boots on for so long that when he finally removed them, his skin peeled off with his socks. He remarked at the time, "I strain more than any man who ever lived." Michelangelo allowed no one to watch his work on the chapel, except for Pope Julius, who sometimes showed up to pester him about when he would finish. "When I am able," Michelangelo snapped back. Meanwhile, Michelangelo was sending the money he made from the chapel home to his brother, who was trying to establish a business. Michelangelo always lived modestly and saved his earnings to send to his family. Although a man of quick temper and intensity, he was said to always be gentle with his friends and forgiving with his ungrateful and sometimes difficult family. As Michelangelo continued on the chapel, Pope Julius went off to fight the French and stopped paying Michelangelo. Still, the artist carried on until finally, on August 4, 1511, the ceiling was unveiled to the public. People came from miles around to see Michelangelo's work, and poems were written in praise of it. The Renaissance writer Giorgio Vasari said there is no other work to compare with this for excellence, nor could there be. 2 years after the ceiling was completed, Pope Julius died, but he had the foresight to leave Michelangelo the money to complete his tomb. Michelangelo continued to work on sketches and sculptures for the tomb, but the new Pope, Leo X, soon diverted the artist's attention with projects of his own. Leo X was the son of Michelangelo's original patron, Lorenzo de' Medici, and the two had been friends since childhood. When Pope Leo asked Michelangelo to design a facade or front for the family church in Florence, Michelangelo happily agreed. A special road was built through the mountains so that Michelangelo could be supplied with the marble he needed. Michelangelo put 3 years of planning and work into the facade, but then Medici family politics brought the entire project to a halt. Another Medici, Cardinal Giulio de' Medici, asked Michelangelo to work instead on the funeral chapel of the Medici church. The following year, Michelangelo's contract with Pope Leo for the facade was canceled. Michelangelo was furious. He had wasted 3 years of his time on the facade. Yet in spite of his bitterness, he began planning the funeral chapel. It would include tombs of Cardinal Giulio and of Lorenzo de' Medici. Michelangelo designed a seated statue to represent each of the men, one of day and night, and one of dawn and dusk. The Medici chapel marks a dramatic shift in the work of Michelangelo. For though his statues still retain the human dignity in all his work, there is also an element of sadness. From here on, Michelangelo displayed more of the artificial ideal of beauty that characterized the development of mannerism in art. While Michelangelo was working on his plans for the chapel, Cardinal Giulio had become the new pope, Pope Clement VII, and Michelangelo returned to Rome to discuss with him the plans for the chapel and for the adjoining library. Their discussions were never completed. War had erupted once again. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V had started an uprising and was marching through Italy. In 1527, Rome was invaded. The Pope was captured, escaped, and fled into exile. Back in Florence, there was also trouble. The people of the city, tired of the dictatorship of the Medicis, had revolted. The rulers had fled in terror, and now Florence was a republic. The Medicis, with help from Pope Clement, gathered an army and descended on the city. In his heart, Michelangelo had little respect for the Medicis, even though they had been his patrons. His love and loyalty was with the people of Florence, and his one desire was to help the new republic fight for its liberty. He accepted the assignment of designing fortifications for the city. Florence was under siege for many months. Hundreds died of hunger and sickness. Finally, unable to endure any longer, the Florentines opened the city gates and the Medici army marched in. An order was issued to find and assassinate Michelangelo Buonarroti, who was considered a traitor. The artist hid at the house of a friend until the following year, when Pope Clement entered Florence and gave Michelangelo clemency. Back in favor again, Michelangelo resumed his work on the Medici chapel and the library, but soon he resettled in Rome. The new Duke of Florence had taken a dislike of the artist, and Michelangelo no longer felt safe in the city of his childhood. On horseback, he headed through the gates of the city towards Rome, unaware he would never see his home again. In Rome, Pope Clement now asked Michelangelo to paint the end wall of the Sistine Chapel, called the altar wall. But popes came and went quickly in these days, and soon Clement died to be replaced by Pope Paul III. Michelangelo continued with the work under the new pope, but the work was difficult, and Michelangelo was often ill from the strain of it. In 1541, he fell from the scaffold and suffered a painful leg injury. After several days in bed, he returned and worked until the wall was completed. The theme of the altar wall was the Last Judgment, the day when all humans must stand before God and be judged for their actions on earth. As usual, Michelangelo allowed no one to see his work in progress. Once, when an employee of the Pope pestered Michelangelo for admittance, the artist took his revenge by including the official among the damned in hell, being tormented by devils. The man complained to Pope Paul, but the Pope replied, "God has given me authority in heaven and on earth, but my writ does not extend to hell." While working on the altar wall, Michelangelo formed a deep attachment with a noblewoman named Vittoria Colonna, a deeply religious widow who lived in a convent. The two often met on Sundays on a hill that had a lovely view of Rome. It was a period of religious revival for Michelangelo, and also a period when he wrote large amounts of poetry, usually with a religious theme. He believed that Vittoria had helped deepen his connection with God. Michelangelo was overwhelmed with grief when she died in 1547, and from then on he seemed to become progressively more morose. Michelangelo never married and never had children. Once when a priest remarked on the sadness of this, the artist replied, "I have too much of a wife in this art of mine, which has afflicted me throughout my life, and my children shall be the works I leave." When the wall of the Sistine Chapel was complete, Michelangelo set out to produce another of his children. He climbed back onto a scaffold, this time to paint frescoes on the walls of the Pope's private chapel, a task that took the now aged Michelangelo 8 years to complete. The subject of his work were St. Peter and St. Paul. Michelangelo became very ill during this project and nearly died, but a friend nursed him back to health, and he completed the walls and moved on to his next work. He was now 70 years old. 1545 was a momentous year for Michelangelo, and undoubtedly a year of great relief. It was the year he finally finished the statues for his albatross, the tomb of Julius II. One sculpture for the tomb, a sculpture of Moses, is considered among his best works. It is said that when someone remarked on the absence of realism in a sculpture of Medici family members, he remarked, "Who will care in 1,000 years' time whether these are their features or not?" Although the tomb itself, which had haunted him all his life, never was completed, Michelangelo seemed to relax a bit after its statues were in place. 2 years later, Michelangelo was assigned by the Pope, still Pope Paul III, to direct the building of the new St. Peter's in Rome. Michelangelo was joyful. St. Peter's was the church of the popes in Rome. It was the most important church in Christendom. He told the Pope he would accept no money for the task, for only in this way could he truly serve God. He made drawings and models of his design for the dome and its base. The base he built himself. He worked 17 years on St. Peter's, but the dome would not be built until long after his death. This dome, as designed by Michelangelo, rises as a symbol for people who approach from a distance, a symbol of the meaning and purpose of the city it graces. The design has been copied many times, including in the Capitol at Washington, D.C. At the same time as his work on St. Peter's, Michelangelo began to design his own tomb. He began carving a Pieta, but became unhappy with it, and his students had to prevent him from smashing it. As it was, he managed to destroy one leg of the Christ figure. Michelangelo had always been a perfectionist, and throughout his life was filled with frustration and despair at what he could not attain. No amount of praise or success ever allayed his own feelings of inadequacy. The effort of cutting the marble for his own Pieta had exhausted Michelangelo, and had revealed how much of his strength had been lost with age. He told his friend, the writer Vasari, "I am so old that death often plucks at my mantle to bear me away, and one day my body will fall like this." With that, he dropped the lantern he'd been holding, so that all was in darkness. More commissions came from Rome during this time, designs for fortifications, for a bridge, and for a government square. Exhausted and depressed by the death of his longtime servant, Michelangelo fled to the hills for a rest. He returned to Rome refreshed, and took up his work on St. Peter's again. He was now nearly 90, and he had not stopped working in 75 years. He was disappointed in himself, feeling he'd failed to reach perfection, and he took to burning many of his drawings so that people would never know how dismally he'd failed. He dictated a will which read in part, "My soul to God, my body to the earth, and my belongings to my nearest relative." He was ill but refused to take to his bed, and strolled outside into the rain instead. Within a few days he was too ill to rise, and as he lay, finally in bed, he said, "I regret that I am dying just as I am beginning to learn the alphabet of my profession." Michelangelo died on February 18, 1564. His body was laid in state at a nearby church, and artists from all over Rome came to pay their respects. His nephew had the body secretly taken away to Florence in the middle of the night. There, Michelangelo's coffin was carried to the family church, with every member of the Artists' Academy following behind. At the church, the coffin was opened so that all could view the body one more time. Legend has it that the body of Michelangelo had not decayed, though Michelangelo had left it 3 weeks before. It was said to look perfect, and that his face had a sweet, restful expression. His flesh, they say, felt soft and lifelike. It is also said that when the coffin was opened again 150 years later, the body still looked perfect. Some believe this was a sign that Michelangelo had been divine. Whether there was divinity in Michelangelo cannot be answered. Whether there was divinity in his work cannot be questioned. His most important and most famous of those works emerged 500 years later as the Pietà, the Statue of David, and the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo was pleased and enthusiastic over his commission to do the Pietà. He relished the opportunity to finally depict a religious scene, having tired of the pagan themes he'd previously worked on. To find the best piece of marble for his Pietà, Michelangelo went to a quarry in northern Italy. As he carved the marble, he envisioned the result this way. He imagined that the figures he saw were imprisoned in the stone, and that he had only to free them by chipping steadily away at the marble. The complex problem he faced was to extract two figures from one block of marble, an unusual and difficult undertaking in any age. Yet with these two figures, he was to accomplish a moving example of contrasts, male and female, dead and alive, vertical and horizontal, clothed and naked. When he completed the statue in 1500, it was acclaimed as the most beautiful sculpture in all of Rome. The sculpture was plainer, less intricate than statues before it, but its simplicity gave it a strength and poignancy. The statue is also remarkable for its realism. The veins and muscles on the limbs of Christ look as if they might pulsate. The cloaks on the figures fall in drapes like real cloth. The Pietà made Michelangelo, then only 25 years old, famous throughout Italy. When people asked him why he had given the Mother of Christ such a youthful face, he responded that as Christ's mother, she was eternally young and pure. The Pietà was also a work that Michelangelo himself took great pride in. In fact, one day, he heard a group of people admiring the Pietà and mistakenly attributing it to the sculpture Il Gobbo. Michelangelo returned after dark that evening and carved his name into the sculpture so no similar mistake would be made in the future. It is the only time he identified one of his works with his signature. The Statue of David, which followed on the heels of the Pietà, was a colossal undertaking in both size and in artistic challenge. Michelangelo chose a block of marble that was 18 feet high, 3 times taller than he himself, which weighed several tons. It was damaged when he found it, abandoned by another sculptor 35 years earlier. First, Michelangelo made a wax model of his David. Then he erected a shed around the marble so no one could watch while he worked. Next he began carving, looking once again for the imprisoned figure that waited within. He found it. The statue is known for its beautiful proportions and its graceful, natural pose. It was decided the statue would be set up outside the Palazzo Vecchio, the city hall, where it could stand as a symbol of strength and courage for all of Florence. David was placed on a cart and pulled slowly through the streets towards the city hall. People watched, fascinated, as the enormous statue swayed back and forth in the frame which held it upright. 4 days after it arrived at the square, a crowd gathered for its official unveiling. Church bells rang out as David was placed on his pedestal, and all day the people of Florence celebrated with parades and dancing. David was later moved indoors, where the weather could not damage it. But it remains a dramatic tribute to the nobility of man and to the beauty of the human form. In art history, it is known for its successful blending of classicalism and humanism. It is the prime example of the Renaissance ideal of perfect humanity. This ideal, achieved in sculpture, would be achieved in paint 7 years later in Michelangelo's work on the Sistine Chapel. The painting was begun in 1508 and was completed in 1511. The center of the ceiling consists of 9 scenes from the first book of the Bible, Genesis. There are 3 scenes: God's creation of the world, the story of Adam and Eve, and Noah and the flood. Around these scenes are figures of prophets and sibyls, ancient female prophets. It was unusual to include female prophets in such works, although it had been done a few times before. The figures on the Sistine Chapel are painted so beautifully, they look like they have been carved. Michelangelo painted over 300 figures altogether. They represent the history of the world according to the Old Testament. He worked backwards, painting the last scenes of Noah first and working his way towards the first scenes of creation. The way the figures were arranged to be perceived by an eye looking up from below is a remarkable feat that required great skill and planning. It is the most complex composition in the history of Western art. The altar wall of the Sistine Chapel, completed 33 years after the ceiling, is a superb rendition of the Last Judgment. Christ appears on a cloud, weighing the words and deeds of each person below, separating those who deserve eternal reward from those who have earned retribution. The figures are all in violent motion. Angels drive sinners out of heaven. Mortals plead and mourn, hope and rejoice. Every human emotion is expressed on the fresco, and all the emotions unite in a stunning expression of human bliss and human suffering. Michelangelo also painted himself into the Last Judgment. The face of the martyred Saint Bartholomew is a self-portrait. The people of Rome were stupefied at the sight of Michelangelo's work. Some were shocked by its violence. "It's a mass of wrath, vengeance, and hate," wrote one author. Others believed the painting had miraculous powers. The painting evokes from its audience the same depth and variety of emotions that are reflected in the figures of the painting itself. This ability to capture and evoke human emotion from the hard lifelessness of stone or through the flowing mobility of paint was a consistent aspect of Michelangelo's genius. He once wrote, "Painting and sculpture are one and the same thing. Every painter should not fail to do sculpture as well as painting, and likewise the sculptor. I mean by sculpture that which is done by taking away. That which is done by adding is like painting." Taking away and adding. To him, art was a way to discover and to enhance beauty that already existed in an invisible but attainable form. Michelangelo saw art as a divine calling for the purpose of dignifying and celebrating the human form and human life. At the same time, he recognized the link between human suffering and beauty, between human suffering and salvation. The force, beauty, and movement of his figures is what makes Michelangelo's art fascinating to the eye. But what is fascinating to the soul is that his art, like that of Beethoven and Shakespeare, recognizes that in the tragic experience of humanity, there is also beauty.
This is the end of the session.